I'm going to take things just a touch out of order from my original notes and begin this morning with just a real quick introduction into who the Nehemiah mission is, because sometimes I find that as familiar as a congregation may be with our organization, there are sometimes visitors or folks that aren't familiar with who we are. So before I get into my message, let me just explain that the mission was started in 2003 as a mission, actually as a program of the old People's Hope United Methodist Church. Do we have anyone here who had any connection to People's Hope? No? Okay. By 2003, that church had dwindled down to about 20 or 30 people. And they were one of the larger buildings in the district, but one of the poorest, actually the poorest in the Cleveland area. Their pastor came up with the concept of creating an outreach center where people could come and stay and live while they worked in the city doing restorative work for individuals and neighborhoods. So the kinds of things that happen at the Nehemiah mission are we build wheelchair ramps, we repair porches, we paint houses, we fix roofs, we hang drywall, we demolish garages, sometimes on purpose, and we provide help to other organizations that might be doing food pantries, homeless shelters, and so forth. In 2009, we adopted a new mission statement, and that mission statement reads, "The Nehemiah mission of Cleveland rebuilds the lives and homes of the physically and fiscally challenged of Cleveland by providing services that improve living environments in order to sow seeds of hope for individuals and neighborhoods." So, in support of that, we have now housed over 10,000 people who have come from as far away as Elmsett, England, and as nearby as across the street from the mission at 65th and Bridge Avenue. We've accomplished over 1,000 projects around the city, both east and west side, and some in the inner ring suburbs as well. Last year alone, we did 138 projects that were in 66 different homes. This year, we're in the midst of our busy summer season, and we are probably going to break some new records this year. So, as we prepare for the message this morning, I'd ask that Mike, my new buddy Mike back there, if you wouldn't mind running that short video. This is just a short promotional video that shows you some images of what we do, and we use this to send around to various churches throughout the conference and throughout the world, actually, to give them an idea of what we do. And of course, send me to the city where the words of Nehemiah, as he answered Artaxerxes' question of what he would do about the disaster that remained in Jerusalem following the attack from Babylon 70 years earlier. Well, this morning I'd like to greet you. On behalf of my wife, Robin, who announced to me late last night that she's still on vacation, so she was going to sleep in this morning. And that's okay. This lady gets up at 4 a.m. every day and goes to the Cleveland Clinic, where she spends 10 to 12 hours a day in surgery. So I'm happy to let her have that break this morning. She's also the daughter of a United Methodist minister. And the prayer that you prayed this morning, the prayer of St. Francis, was used as I thought about my father-in-law this morning, as he was the pastor who founded the Metropolitan Mission Council in Cleveland many, many, many years ago. And as we trace the evolution of my job today, we actually discovered about 2 years ago that my current job today traces right back to what my father-in-law was doing back in the 60s. In fact, I think they pay me from the same line item at the district office. And I think the same amount, actually. I also bring greetings from Pleasant Hills United Methodist Church, which is just down the road from you on Bagley Road in Middleburg Heights. I was surprised to see this morning when I was looking at your website that Lucy Mercer had been your music director here. And I knew Lucy years ago when I first went to Pleasant Hills back in the early 80s. She was the organist there at that time. So it's good to have a connection with you folks at that level. So we just came back from annual conference. Is the annual conference delegate here this morning? Was it a great time? It is, isn't it? The worship experience is wonderful. And it was kind of a calm conference. There were no real controversial issues or anything. How many of you followed the general conference, either online or in the news? A few of you did. It was not the most, it wasn't our best showing. How's that? And so, as I move forward here and I tell you what I'm about to do, I hope that you don't panic, okay? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a short passage from the Book of Discipline. Aren't you excited? Let's hear it. We're excited. We're going to hear from the Book of Discipline. Hear these words from the United Methodist Book of Discipline, from the Mission and Service section. It says, "We insist that personal salvation always involves Christian mission and service to the world. By joining heart and hand, we assert that personal religion, evangelical witness, and Christian social action are reciprocal and mutually reinforcing. Scriptural holiness entails more than personal piety. Love of God is always linked with love of neighbor, a passion for justice and renewal in the life of the world. The general rules represent one traditional expression of intrinsic relationship between Christian life and thought as understood within the Wesleyan tradition." And so now hear these words from Micah. It's probably a lot easier to understand. This is Micah 6:8. "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God." What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God? I love that scripture. It's one of my favorite. I find it beautiful. I find it comforting. I find it compelling. And I also find it a little odd and curious at the same time. See, I understand walking humbly with God. It simply means that we don't have to have all the answers all the time. And isn't that comforting? We walk humbly knowing that we may be wrong even about the things we know the most about. Well, people who know me quite well know that I'm not real good at it. I understand humility, and I hope that if I can't be humble with anyone else, I would at least be humble as I walk with God. I think I get the requirement to do justice. As hard as I try, my version of justice sometimes makes my "what would Jesus do" bracelet hang really heavy. So while I might not be really good at that, I understand fairly well what it means to do justice. The phrase that I've always struggled with, however, is to love mercy. See, if it said "be merciful," I get that. I couldn't understand what it meant to love mercy because that is different. So a couple summers ago, I had a work team in from a place called North Ridgeville, Ohio. And they were out busy working in the inner city doing whatever they were doing that week. I don't remember what it was. I had a knock on the door, and I went to the door, and there stood my Uncle Ralph, 85 years old, retired United Methodist minister, who had traveled from his home in Maple Heights to come on over to the Nehemiah mission and see what his crazy nephew was doing. And so I took him on a tour of the building. Now, he was really familiar with the building because many, many years before that, he had been sponsored into ministry by the Old People's Hope Church. So he knew the building quite well. He just didn't know what it looked like as the Nehemiah mission. So we toured around the mission, and we talked about the United Methodist Church, and we talked about its rich history of mission, and we got into a discussion about John Wesley. Specifically, we talked about John Wesley's foundry. Now, if you look in your hymnals, look at several hymns that you might be able to find, you'll find a notation down at the bottom of many of them that will say, "From the Foundry Collection." And if you've ever seen that and wondered what that meant, I'm about to tell you. You see, in 1739, John Wesley was looking for a space that he could use for worship and study, but he also wanted a space that could serve as a center for ministry to the poor. The building he chose was a former arsenal. It had been ruined by an accidental explosion several years earlier. Isn't that fun? He leased the building and fixed it up as best as he could, but this building that Wesley and his Methodists referred to as the Foundry was in constant need of repair. Kind of reminds me of the Nehemiah mission. The preaching room had space for about 1,500 people. The band room, and when I say band, these are not musical bands. These were small bands of people who gathered. But the band room seated another 300. One area was used as a classroom, another area as a book room, and above the band room was an apartment where Wesley actually housed his mother, Susanna, in her declining years. He held his first service in the building on November 11th, 1739, and later wrote, "I preached at 8 a.m. to 5,000 or 6,000 on the spirit of bondage and the spirit of adoption, and again at 5 in the evening in the place which had been the king's foundry for cannon. O hasten thou the time when nations shall not learn war anymore." The foundry was the headquarters of Methodism for 38 years, as well as the center for charitable agencies, including a dispensary of food and clothing, a shelter for poor widows, a school for children of the poor, literacy programs for adults and children, and free medical clinics for the poor. My Uncle Ralph talked about this as if he had been there. Well, the reality is that he pretty much had been. He spent his ministry during urban ministry. He devoted most of his time beyond People's Hope Church, he spent at Schaefer Memorial, which is over on the east side of Cleveland, and we're sorry to report was just closed and was in the process of being sold today. But as he talked about Wesley's Foundry, at one point he stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at me and he smiled and he said, "Do you know what you have here?" He said, "You have Wesley's Foundry." Well, this is my favorite uncle. And to have him compare what I was doing to what John Wesley was doing, well, that made me really proud. It was hard to walk humbly at that moment. We operate a food pantry. We sponsor a Boy Scout troop, a Girl Scout troop, a Cub Scout pack. We partner with Family Promise to provide situationally homeless people the opportunity to get reestablished and move into their homes, into new homes. We work with St. Herman's House of Hospitality, which is a shelter for homeless men. We've assisted hundreds, thousands of people repairing their homes. We built wheelchair ramps and cleaned up yards, and we've painted houses and built playgrounds, and we've sent teams to assist other agencies, as I mentioned earlier. We now have a children's program for Liberian children who have found themselves now living on the near west side of Cleveland. This summer, we're going to host 5 weeks of Vacation Bible School, which starts tomorrow morning. So when I think about that, it was hard to be humble. But then, I look around the neighborhood and see how much work is left to do. And I think about things that have happened at the mission. My humility returned when I remember an autistic child who was unable to play in his own yard because of a dilapidated fence and a pit bull in the neighbor's yard. Bad combination. But because some adults and children from southern Ohio came to the mission loving mercy, they built a fence around that property, and that little boy can play in his yard today. I think about Norman, our 91-year-old neighbor who's a veteran of World War II, who lives by himself, whose wife died 20-some years ago, and he pretty much just lost connection with the world at that point. His house fell into disrepair. His only living relative being his son, who on Christmas Day of 2011 died, leaving Norman by himself. But what Norman had on that morning was a record player that had been brought to him by a youth worker, volunteer from Medina United Methodist, who had visited Norman in the summertime, and Norman had shown him his record collection, and he didn't have any way of playing those records. This young man went to a garage sale and bought a record player, and 2 weeks before Christmas of 2010, brought Norman a record player. And so, on that Christmas morning when he got word that his son had died, Norman was able to play Christmas records. I want to tell you about Lana and her 8-year-old Brandon. Remember I said I was going to talk about Brandon? Lana came to us because she'd been a prostitute. And she found the church. And Jesus had turned her life around. But Lana was being beaten by her live-in boyfriend. And so her pastor said, "We've got to get you out of here." So he brought Lana and her 8-year-old to the mission and asked if we could house them temporarily until they found overnight accommodations that were safe. And so we brought them into the mission and we set them up at our second building, which we use for emergency housing from time to time. And we got them settled into a room. And I asked if they would like to pray at that point. And little Brandon raised his hand and he said, "I will." And so we grabbed hands. And this was Brandon's prayer. "Our Father, you be living in heaven. Arthur be your name. Give me some of that bread and some of them bus passes, and all the glory be yours. Amen. Then he looked at me and he said, I kind of messed that up, didn't I? I said, no, I don't think you did, Brandon. My humility returned when I remember our Liberian children who have moved into the neighborhood, who, I want to tell you about Masanji. Masanji came to the door one day, and Becky Trout, who's one of our new staff members, answered the door, and Masanji said, I want to talk to the boss. Becky said, about what? She goes, I want to talk to the boss. She says, are you going to get me in trouble? And Masanji said, I want to talk to the boss. Well, Masanji didn't know I was the boss. I was sitting right there. So I said, let me go see if he's in. So I walked into my office and I called Becky on her phone and I said, bring Masanji into my office. Masanji walks into the door. She looks at me and she goes, you are the boss? I said, yes, ma'am. What can I do for you? She says, I want to help. I said, what would you like to do? I want to help. I said, well, who do you want to help? I want to help Becky. And I said, well, mostly what Becky does is clean toilets. And Masanji said, then I will clean the toilets. Masanji loves mercy. But really the humility returns to me because I realize that it is not my works, it's not my justice that's going on, it's not my mercy. It is the work of God being done by the people of God who understand, who love mercy, and walk humbly. The 10,000 or so missionaries who have come to Cleveland and worked with the Nehemiah Mission, and the countless churches and individuals who support us financially do not do so out of religious obligation. They do this because they love mercy. Your children come to the Nehemiah Mission because they love mercy. John Wesley and the early Methodists did not do their work out of duty. They did it because they loved mercy. How proud we should be of our United Methodist heritage. The outreach that we do to the poor and the needy through UMCOR and other agencies. Do you know that when there's a disaster somewhere in the world, there are two agencies that respond immediately? The first being the Red Cross. They go in and stabilize the emergency situation, and then they make a call to UMCOR. First call. UMCOR arrives, and they are committed to be there until the crisis is over and repaired. Go to Mississippi, go down to New Orleans, and what you will find all these years later are still outreach centers sponsored by UMCOR where people who love mercy are going there to repair that area from the damage caused by Katrina. Why? Because they love mercy. This church has a history of showing that they love mercy. You send people to Joplin, you send people to Nehemiah, you send them other places. I noticed in your online presence that you have a connection in Mexico. You love mercy. I give thanks for all of you. What you've done and what you will do. You are the physical presence that is that still small voice and the mighty breath of God breathing hope into the lives of others. Why? Because in the great tradition of John Wesley, you don't talk about outreach, you live outreach, you love mercy. And even in this economy where challenges may be too close for comfort, you continue to show the love of Jesus to this community and to the world. You need to be very, very proud of yourselves, and it's okay. So you see, what happened in the Foundry did not stay in the Foundry. It's that mission-rich history that makes us United Methodists and helps us to be true to God's simple request, love mercy. Mike asked, what does the Lord require? And we answer. The section of the United Methodist Book of Discipline that discusses distinctive Wesleyan emphasis stresses the relationship between personal salvation and social action. John Wesley understood that we are all broken, and it is only God's mercy that holds us together. Our social action is born out of our own experience of God's mercy. Wesley insisted that we love because God first loved us. We are merciful because God has first shown mercy to us. And if we can love his mercy, we can love being merciful to others, not out of duty or obligation, but because we love mercy. And what does the Lord require? Do justice, love mercy,